My name's Rick. I'm 52 now, but this happened back in the fall of 2013, when I was 40. I'd been living alone in a cabin deep in the woods outside Missoula, Montana for about 6 years at that point. I'd built the place myself with timber from the land, just a small single-room structure with a wood stove, cot, table, and shelves I put together from old barn wood. I lived off what I could hunt, trap, and gather. Sometimes I'd head down into town for supplies, but not often. I liked the solitude. I liked the quiet. That's why I'd moved out there in the first place. It wasn't that I hated people. I just never did well in crowds. Too much noise, too many demands. I'd worked construction most of my life, and when the housing crash hit in '08, I'd had enough. Took the little I had saved, bought a piece of cheap land up a few miles past Willow Creek, and started over. No one came out that way except the occasional hunter or lost hiker. By that fall, I had a good system down. I had 2 snares set about a quarter-mile east, one near a deadfall where I'd seen rabbit runs, the other near a narrow trail that foxes and sometimes bobcats used. I fished the creek and smoked the trout I caught. I had a hand-crank radio, enough salt and flour to get me through, and firewood stacked chest-high along the side of the cabin. I kept to myself. No trouble, no noise, just me and the woods, until the second week of October. The weather had shifted early that year. Nights dropped into the 20s, and by morning, the edges of the creek were crusted in frost. I'd already started wearing my heavier jacket and boots lined with old wool. That Tuesday morning, I woke before the sun, like always, and stepped outside with my thermos of boiled coffee. It was quiet except for the breeze ticking through the pine needles. Then I noticed something strange, a boot print. It was in the dirt just past my woodpile, half filled in from wind-blown pine needles, but fresh. It wasn't mine. I hadn't been around the woodpile since the afternoon before, and I always knew where I stepped. This one was bigger than mine, maybe a size 13, worn tread, looked like a logging boot. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. Nothing else looked off. My snare lines weren't close enough for someone to see unless they were walking the brush with purpose, and there were no tire tracks on the dirt road that cut through the ridge about a mile off. Still, someone had come through here. I didn't panic. Not yet. There were hunters who strayed further than they meant to, sometimes campers who didn't have maps. I figured someone had wandered a little too close and kept going. But I still unhooked the old .30-30 lever-action rifle I kept above the stove and cleaned it that afternoon, just in case. By the next day, I was starting to forget about it. Nothing else seemed out of place, and there were no new tracks. I kept myself busy by cleaning the fish smoker and checking the traps. Around dusk, I hauled a couple logs inside, stoked the stove, and read an old copy of Field and Stream by Oil Lamp. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up cold. The stove had burned down to coals. I sat up on the cot and grabbed my coat, planning to throw in another couple logs, but as I was reaching for the poker, I heard something. A dull thud outside, not like an animal running or a branch falling. More like something bumped the cabin wall. I froze. It was pitch black inside. My lamp was out and I didn't want to light it unless I had to. I stayed still, trying to listen. Another bump, this time closer to the window. It was slow, like whoever or whatever was outside was circling. I reached for the rifle slowly, careful not to knock over the metal cup on the floor beside me. The cot creaked as I shifted my weight, and then everything outside went still. Silent again except for the wind. I waited like that, holding the rifle across my lap, heart pounding in my ears. 15 minutes passed. Nothing. I finally stood and walked to the stove, set a few logs in quietly, and lit the fire back up. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I checked around the cabin. Sure enough, there were tracks. The same boots as before, only now the prints circled the cabin. Some stopped right under the window, others at the front door. No prints coming in or out from the trail. Whoever it was had approached from the forest, not the road. The idea that someone was creeping around my place at night didn't sit right. And no one left a note or knocked or shouted. Just walked around and left. That day, I didn't go far. I kept the rifle with me and stacked more firewood, pretending to be busy while watching the woods. Nothing moved. No birds even. It was like the forest had gone quiet with me. That night, I didn't sleep much either. I set up an old tin pan with some nails and broken glass in it outside the window, like a makeshift trip alarm. Nothing triggered it, but I kept hearing sounds in the distance. Cracks, steps, maybe my imagination. I locked the door with a bar I wedged under the knob. It wouldn't stop much, but it gave me peace of mind. The third night was the worst. I was trying to sleep, wrapped in a blanket with the fire going low. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, I heard it again, the crunch of boots on dry leaves. Then something scraping against the cabin wall. I sat up, fully alert, and pointed the rifle toward the door. My whole body was tense. Then I heard it again. This time it wasn't the wall, it was the doorknob. Someone was testing it, slowly turning it back and forth. They didn't knock, didn't say a word. I stood quietly and stepped to the door, not breathing. I thought about yelling, but what would that do? I didn't want to let them know I was scared. Then I heard one long, slow drag across the wooden door. Fingernails, maybe. It made the hair on my neck rise. After a few seconds, I heard steps moving away from the cabin. No rush, just slow and steady. I waited until dawn before stepping out again. This time I found more than footprints. Behind the cabin, under one of the small windows, there was something laid out in the dirt. For animal bones, long and clean, set in a straight line like some kind of marker. One of them still had dried sinew attached. I didn't recognize the animal, maybe a coyote or a small deer, but they weren't there the day before. That's when I knew this wasn't just a lost hiker. Someone was watching me. I spent the day building traps around the property. I dug shallow holes and set sharpened sticks inside. Tied thin fishing line between trees at ankle height. Not to hurt anyone, just to slow them down or alert me. I moved my cot away from the window and kept the rifle loaded beside me at all times. Over the next few days, I didn't see anyone, but I could feel them out there. I'd go out to the creek and come back to find small changes. My axe moved slightly, a fish from the drying rack missing, one snare line cut and tied back with a different knot than I'd used. They were watching everything. I thought about hiking into town, but it was over 12 miles through rough forest, and I didn't want to leave the cabin unguarded. Besides, I didn't have cell service and no working vehicle. My truck had been dead since spring. I held out for another few days, ate little, slept less. Then one morning, I woke up to find a wooden carving on my doorstep. It was about 6 inches long, shaped like a human figure, with deep cuts for eyes and a slashed mouth. Looked like it was whittled with a pocket knife. That's what finally made me decide to leave. I packed up a rucksack with jerky, a map, water, and extra ammo. I wrapped my rifle in cloth and tied it to the side. I didn't leave a note. I just locked the cabin, strapped my boots tight, and started walking east toward the county road. About 6 hours in, I heard something behind me. I stopped, listened. It was far off, but I could hear branches breaking. Someone was following me. Slow and steady, not trying to catch up, just keep pace. I kept moving, didn't run, didn't look back much. When I finally hit the gravel road, I walked another 4 miles until I saw the roof of an old ranger station. It was boarded up, but there was an emergency radio inside. I called it in. Sheriff's deputies met me 2 hours later. I told them what happened. They said they'd send someone to check the cabin. 2 days later, they got back to me. They said they found the cabin just like I described. Traps around it, carving on the porch, footprints in the dirt, but no sign of the person following me. The woods were too thick.
No cameras.
No name, no face, just someone out there watching. I never went back. A year later, I sold the land to a rancher who wanted it for grazing. I live in Idaho now, in a small trailer outside Salmon. Still off-grid, but closer to people. I haven't been in the deep woods since. I don't know what that man wanted. Maybe he lived out there too, didn't like me being close. Maybe he was just twisted and liked the idea of watching someone lose their mind. All I know is I was never alone out there, not really. And I don't think I ever was from the start. I don't even know why I'm writing this. Maybe so someone else doesn't do what I did. Or maybe so I can stop waking up in a cold sweat thinking I'm still there, in that rotten-smelling cabin, with the floor shifting under me, the air full of mildew, sweat, and something worse. It's been nearly 6 months since it happened. I've gotten back to work, gone on with my life, but there's not a single night I don't think about what could have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer. I was 34 that spring, living in rural Idaho, outside a small town called Elkview. I worked part-time doing contract fence installations, and the rest of my income came from odd landscaping jobs. I wasn't rich, but I did all right. More importantly, I liked my space. I lived in a small trailer on the edge of a patch of BLM land, and I could hike straight from my back door into the hills without seeing a soul. That particular April, I was on a real fitness kick. I'd been hitting the trails almost every day after work. I had this big goal of doing a solo overnight hike before summer, so I started pushing myself deeper into the woods, following game trails, studying topographical maps, even testing out cooking with a portable stove. I was trying to build confidence. Looking back now, I realize how little I actually knew. It started on a Saturday. I woke up early, packed a thermos of coffee, some jerky, a water filter, and my small day pack with a knife, lighter, and basic supplies. I headed out a little past 6 a.m. The air was cold but clean, the kind of morning that makes you feel like everything's wide open. I hiked northeast toward a ridgeline I hadn't explored yet. On the map, it looked like there were some old logging paths in that area, long abandoned. I figured I'd check one out, maybe follow it up to the edge of the forest boundary and loop back around. After maybe 2.5 hours, I spotted a narrow deer trail running perpendicular to the one I was on. Something about it caught my attention. It wasn't just a game trail. It looked like it might have once been man-made, overgrown with saplings and brush, and stupidly, I decided to follow it. I remember thinking how strange it was that the air felt different once I started down that trail. It wasn't colder or anything. It just felt still, like the wind didn't reach there. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birdsong, no breeze in the leaves, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I passed what looked like a rusted wheelbarrow half buried in moss, and a couple of times I saw metal barrels, dented and blackened, maybe from fire. It was clear someone had been out here a long time ago. Then I saw it. Through a cluster of pines, maybe 200 feet off the trail, stood a structure. Not a shack or a lean-to, a cabin, full-sized, slanted roof, faded siding, 2 visible windows. I stood still for a long time just looking at it. I should have turned around right there, but I didn't. Instead, I got curious. I told myself it was probably an old ranger station or a trapper's cabin, maybe abandoned in the 70s or earlier. I figured I'd get a few pictures, poke around, then head back before the sun dropped too far. I veered off the trail and made my way through the trees. Up close, it was worse than I thought. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. One of the window panes was shattered. The wood siding was gray and warped, covered in lichen and rot. The roof had sagged in the middle, probably from snow loads over the years. I stood on the porch, which groaned under my weight. The door was slightly ajar. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Rot, old animal droppings, mildew, thick and sour. The cabin had a single main room and a smaller room off to the side that might have been a bedroom or storage. I could see a rusted iron stove in the corner, half buried in pine needles that had blown in through a hole in the ceiling. There was a table with a missing leg and 3 mismatched chairs around it. One had fallen over. On the walls, I saw something that made me pause. Dozens of nails, rusty, crooked, stuck into the planks at eye level, each one with either a tag, a piece of rope, or something I couldn't quite identify. Some looked like old scraps of leather or cloth. Others were just stained paper tags. Most were blank or faded beyond recognition, but a few had dates written in thick pencil. One said November 6, 1979. Another said June 2nd, 1984. The writing wasn't consistent. Different hands, different pressure. I don't know why, but the longer I stood there, the heavier the air felt, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I took a few steps into the room and heard the floor creak loud under me. I backed up, worried it might give way, and I stood still, listening. That's when I heard it. Something in the side room. A shift, like weight on wood. Not a voice, not an animal, just a faint thump. I froze. I strained my ears. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other critter. I wasn't armed, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going that day. That hit me suddenly. I was alone, and no one had any idea where I was. If I got hurt or stuck, I was screwed. I slowly backed toward the door and stepped back out onto the porch. I should have left right then, but I made one last mistake. I walked around the side of the cabin. There was a small outbuilding behind it, maybe 20 feet away. Looked like an old tool shed. The door was hanging by one hinge, and the inside was too dark to see clearly. I leaned in, and my boot kicked something metal. I looked down and saw an old coffee can. Inside were dozens of used .22 shells, all tossed in haphazardly. Some were dented, others corroded. I also saw something that looked like a jawbone, small, maybe from a raccoon or rabbit. There was fur still stuck to it. That's when I noticed the ground around the shed. There were small holes, dozens of them, like something had been dug up or buried. I didn't want to stay any longer. I turned back toward the trail, and that's when I saw the wire. It was strung between 2 trees, about ankle height, barely visible in the leaf litter. I stepped over it carefully, heart pounding. I hadn't seen it before. Had I crossed it on the way in? Had it been moved? Was it even part of a trap? I didn't wait to find out. I picked up my pace and headed back the way I came. But the trail didn't look the same. The light had shifted, and everything felt unfamiliar. I looked for the rusted barrel I'd passed on the way in but didn't see it. I walked in circles, trying to orient myself. After a while, I stopped and pulled out my compass, spun slowly, then stopped, pointing north. I picked a direction and kept walking. 30 minutes later, I found the deer trail again. At least I thought it was. The undergrowth looked fresher, like someone had moved through recently. I saw broken twigs, disturbed leaves. My heart sank when I saw footprints. Not just mine, someone else's. Bigger boot prints going in the same direction I had. But then, they stopped. I looked around and didn't see anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I moved fast. I didn't care if I twisted an ankle. I kept going until I reached a clearing I recognized. Then I booked it downhill until I hit the logging path again. From there, I hiked back, checking over my shoulder constantly. I didn't stop until I saw the rusted cattle gate near my trailer. My legs were shaking. My shirt was soaked with sweat. I locked my door that night and didn't sleep. For the next 2 weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. I started having these dreams. Me standing in front of the cabin, the door wide open, but I couldn't move. Sometimes I'd wake up and swear I heard floorboards creaking. I told myself I was imagining things, just spooking myself. I forced myself to get back on the trails, but I never went back in that direction. Then one afternoon, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was walking back from town and spotted a truck parked off the road near the tree line. Old model Ford, faded blue, beat up. There was no one inside, but in the back, I saw what looked like a shovel, a tarp, and a length of chain. Nothing illegal, but something about the way it was parked, hidden just enough, made my skin crawl. That night, I dreamed about the shed again. This time, the holes were bigger, fresh dirt piled beside them. In the dream, I walked up to one, and something was moving at the bottom. After that, I bought a motion camera and set it up at the edge of the BLM land near my trailer. I wasn't expecting anything, just wanted peace of mind. A week later, I checked the footage. Nothing for days: deer, a raccoon, a fox. Then, at 2:13 a.m., on a Tuesday, the camera triggered. The video showed a man walking along the tree line, alone, wearing heavy boots and a canvas coat. He paused once, looked directly at the camera, then moved on. I didn't sleep that night. I took the camera down the next morning and didn't go back out for a long time. I even considered moving. I told a local sheriff's deputy what I'd seen at the cabin, left out the camera part. But he just shrugged and said there were lots of old cabins out there. Nothing illegal about them. I never went back. Couldn't. About a month later, a hunter went missing in the hills. Young guy from Washington. He told friends he was heading toward the northeast ridge to hunt mule deer. Search teams combed the area for weeks. They found his truck, but nothing else. I knew deep down he'd found the cabin, and I knew he didn't make it back. I was 39 the year I decided to take a solo hunting trip up in northern Idaho. It was late October 2017, the kind of cold where the air feels thin and brittle, and the ground crunches under your boots even when it's not snow-covered. The leaves were long gone. The woods looked bare and exposed. A lot of guys love that kind of hunting, when the brush thins and you can see deeper into the timber. For me, it just makes everything feel more vulnerable, like the trees are bones and you're moving through a skeleton. I'd been going to the same patch of land since my mid-20s. A friend of my uncle's had a lease on a few thousand acres of logging land just outside a town called Avery. You wouldn't find it unless you were looking for it. Real tucked-away type of place, down a gravel road with no signage, and nothing but a few rusted gates and locked chains to show you where it began. There was a cabin up there, a boxy one-story thing with no electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove and a few ratty old beds. It wasn't fancy, but it was shelter, and it had a roof that didn't leak. That's more than you can ask for out in the woods sometimes. I brought my rifle, my food, extra propane for the little heater I carried, and enough coffee to keep my blood circulating. I also packed a cot, even though the cabin had a few bunks, because the mattresses were mildewed and sagging. I'd learned that lesson years ago. I left my phone in the truck once I got there. No signal out that far anyway. That's the way I liked it. The first 2 days were quiet. Cold mornings, still air, no wind. I saw a couple of does in the early hours, but no bucks. Not a single shot fired. I didn't care. I wasn't desperate to tag anything. I liked being out there for the silence, for the rhythm of walking, watching, listening. You stop paying attention to time. Meals become mechanical. Sleep comes whenever it wants to. There's something deeply settling about it, and at the same time, deeply unsettling if you're not used to being alone. But I was. On the third morning, something shifted. I woke up with the kind of unease you can't trace to anything. My body felt normal. No aches or sickness. My stuff was all where I left it. The stove was still warm from the night before, but something was off. I remember sitting on the edge of the cot, trying to explain it to myself. That prickling feeling when you know someone's behind you, even when they're not. It wasn't dramatic, just a tension in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. I went out anyway. I always did. Weather was colder that morning, down in the 20s. My breath hung in front of me like smoke. I hiked east from the cabin, into the gully near the old fire road where I'd seen elk before. It was about 2 miles down, with switchbacks that dropped fast, and thick timber once you got near the creek bed. About an hour in, I spotted movement through the trees. But it wasn't animal movement. It didn't have that four-legged bounce to it. It was upright, quick, then still. I froze. Thought maybe it was another hunter, though no one else was supposed to be out there. Leased land, locked gates. Nobody would have just stumbled into this place. I watched for maybe 10 minutes. Nothing. No sound. No flash of blaze orange or movement. Just the quiet press of the forest. Still, I backed off, circled uphill. Figured if someone else was out there, they could have it to themselves. I wasn't interested in an argument over land I didn't even own. Back at the cabin that night, I couldn't relax. I kept replaying the motion I saw, the speed of it, the shape. It didn't look like someone hiking. It was quick, sharp, low, and it stopped too suddenly, like it wanted me to see it. I told myself it was in my head. My mind playing tricks. Happens when you're alone too long. You start making stories out of shadows. That's what I said as I cooked my freeze-dried beef stew and listened to the fire crack in the stove. Then I found the boot print. It was behind the cabin, near the little rise that overlooked the latrine hole I dug years ago. I wasn't looking for it. I was just stretching my legs, walking a short loop before calling it a night. But there it was in the frost-covered dirt. A partial print, clear heel and arch, pointing toward the cabin. It wasn't mine. Too small, narrower, and the tread wasn't anything I recognized. Almost like a sneaker sole, not a boot. Who the hell wears sneakers this deep into the woods in October? I spent most of that night sitting up. I turned off the heater because I wanted to hear. I figured if anyone got close, I'd catch it, the crunch of footsteps, the snap of twigs. But nothing came, just the usual groans of the cabin settling, the distant calls of owls, and the occasional brush of wind through the pine needles outside. In the morning, I hiked west, away from the creek bed, into the thicker stands. There was an old tree stand I'd built a decade back that still held up. I climbed up, sat still for hours, and watched. Around noon, I saw movement again. This time behind me. I caught it in the corner of my eye as I turned to pour coffee from my thermos. Again, fast. Low. Not a deer. Not a bear. Definitely not a coyote. I sat frozen for a long time, thermos halfway tilted, letting my breath slow down. The trees were quiet again. Too quiet. I waited until the sun started to dip, then climbed down and headed back. Didn't see any tracks this time. Didn't hear anything. But I knew I wasn't alone out there. At the cabin, I checked the perimeter. No new tracks. I kept the door locked, though it never had a real key, just a bolt. I set a metal pot against the door frame so I'd hear if anyone opened it. Then I slept with my rifle beside me. Safety off. At some point, I must have drifted, because I woke up to a faint metallic clink. The pot. My heart kicked so hard I felt it in my throat. I reached for the rifle slowly. The room was pitch black. I waited, strained every muscle listening. Nothing. After 10 minutes, I crept to the door and listened again. Still nothing. I didn't open it. Just sat with the rifle, staring into the dark for hours. The next morning, I found the pot had shifted about 6 inches from where I left it. The door hadn't been opened all the way, just cracked. And on the dirt just outside, 2 new prints. Same as before. Narrow, light, no sign of boot tread. I decided to leave. I packed everything before noon. I didn't want to wait for sundown. I had to hike out about half a mile to get back to my truck parked behind the first locked gate. As I crested the ridge near the main trail, I saw something hanging from a tree about 50 yards off. I walked over to it cautiously. It was a rabbit, skinned, gutted, hung by its hind legs with a length of fishing line. It was fresh, still warm. I didn't stay to study it. I moved faster, keeping my head low, scanning the trees for any shape, any shift of light. My truck was untouched when I reached it. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and didn't stop driving until I was halfway to Coeur d'Alene. I didn't call the cops. What would I say? That someone had followed me in the woods? Left a skinned rabbit? Walked around my cabin? That's not a crime. Not unless they hurt you. So I went home. Weeks passed. I didn't talk about it. Not because I was afraid no one would believe me, but because I didn't want to think about it anymore. But the worst part came 3 months later. I was at a sporting goods store in Spokane, looking for a new sleeping bag. In the hunting section, I saw a trail cam on display. Nothing fancy, just a mid-range motion cam. And then it clicked. I remembered I'd set up an old trail cam near the creek bed 3 years ago, lashed to a tree near a game trail. I'd forgotten all about it. Probably had dead batteries or was long busted. But still, I had to know. Against every instinct in my body, I went back. In March, there was still snow on the ground, though not much. I drove in, hiked down, and found the tree. The cam was still there, faded from sun and cracked a little, but still intact. To my shock, the card was still in it. I brought it home, charged up a reader, loaded the files. There were over 200 photos. Most were just deer, squirrels, wind-blown branches, 1 or 2 bears. Then there were 5 that made my blood turn to ice, all taken within the same night. Time stamped around 3:20 a.m. Person,
No code.
just a sweatshirt and what looked like jeans, barefoot, crouched, and staring right at the camera. In one shot, they were maybe 20 feet away. In the next, they were 5 feet away. By the last shot, their face filled the frame. Pale, dirty, wide-eyed, expressionless. No emotion at all. Just watching. I deleted the photos. Not because I was scared someone would find them, but because I didn't want to ever look at them again. I still remember the face, burned into my mind. I dream about it sometimes. I've never gone back to that cabin. I never told the landowner either. And I don't hunt alone anymore, because the woods aren't empty. Not always. Sometimes people live out there. Not campers, not hikers. People who've slipped between the cracks. People who don't want to be found. People who watch. And if you're unlucky, they watch you. It was early October of 2017 when I left the city behind and drove out to the foothills of eastern Tennessee. I was 34 then, recently laid off from my job at a metal fabrication shop in Chattanooga, and I was just tired. Tired of people. Tired of being inside buildings with fake lights and no windows. Tired of noise, emails, traffic. So when I found a small piece of land for sale out near Tellico Plains, just under 6 acres, backed up against the Cherokee National Forest, I bought it with what was left of my severance. No one was going to build next to me. The road leading up there was gravel, narrow, and mostly forgotten. I didn't have a real plan for what I was going to do. Just knew I wanted to build something myself. Even a small one-room cabin where I could clear my head. I had an old F-150 that I used to haul lumber up there, one load at a time. No foundation, just concrete deck blocks, pressure-treated posts, and floor joists. I wanted to keep it small, 12 feet by 16. Enough for a cot, a little stove, and maybe a small table. I slept in the truck most nights or in a tent I pitched just under a cluster of big maples. Sometimes I stayed for 3 nights straight, sometimes a week. Sometimes I came down the mountain if I needed to grab supplies from a hardware store in Madisonville. The whole area was quiet, too quiet sometimes. No cell signal at all. Once I passed that last cattle gate and wound my way into the trees, I was on my own. I didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, I could feel my shoulders relaxing. I was outside swinging a hammer, lifting lumber, moving dirt. It was hard, physical work, and I loved it, even if I didn't really know what I was doing half the time. That day, the day everything happened, was a Thursday, I think. I remember because I'd driven into town that morning to get more nails, a handsaw, and some brackets. The forecast didn't say anything about rain, just cool weather, cloudy skies. I had maybe 2 or 3 more days of work left on the frame. I'd already set the floor, got 3 of the walls up, and was finishing the 4th one. The roof was just starting to go up, 2 rafters up by that afternoon, not even sheathed yet. I figured I had plenty of time. If it rained, I'd just cover everything in tarps. That was my thinking anyway. By 5 o'clock, the clouds were heavier. I felt it in the air first, a kind of stillness that creeps in just before a storm hits. The birds went quiet. No wind. I should have known better. I grew up around here, but I was focused on finishing the 4th wall. I wanted the frame solid enough so it wouldn't collapse in case there was a storm. I didn't want to haul back up the hill only to find everything soaked and falling apart. So I worked faster. By the time I was ready to climb down from the frame, it was almost dark, and the wind had picked up sharp and sudden, just out of nowhere. I could hear it in the trees, how the leaves started to slap against each other. The clouds overhead looked like a thick blanket being pulled across the sky.
No sunset.
Just deep gray and the last bit of light disappearing fast. Then the first drop hit the back of my neck. Cold, heavy, followed by another, and another. Within seconds, it was raining hard. That kind of southern rain that comes down like a bucket. No slow buildup, just a wall of water. I grabbed the blue tarp I'd stuffed under the deck boards earlier and pulled it over the exposed frame. I nailed part of it down just enough to keep it from flapping too hard. Then I made a run for the tent. By the time I unzipped the flap and got inside, I was soaked. Water ran down the inside of my sleeves, into my boots. I stripped off the wet clothes and wrapped myself in the emergency blanket I kept in my pack. I had a small battery lantern that gave off a dim yellow glow. The sound of the rain on the nylon above me was loud, but there was comfort in it at first. I drank some water, ate a protein bar, and sat back against my sleeping bag, waiting it out. But the rain didn't stop. By midnight, the ground was soggy. Water pooled in low spots around the tent. I stepped outside with my flashlight to check the build site, worried the tarp might have come loose. The beam of light hit the structure about 50 feet away. The tarp was still there, but part of it had sagged from the weight of the water. It held for now, but I couldn't do much in the dark and pouring rain. I was about to head back to the tent when I heard it. A snap, not just a branch falling. It sounded heavier, closer. I stood still, rain dripping off the bill of my cap. I listened, then another sound, quick, sharp, like boots on wet leaves. Not an animal, too deliberate. I killed my light and crouched low. My breathing slowed. The trees around me were thick, maybe 30 or 40 feet tall. The slope behind the tent led down toward a small dry creek bed that only filled after big storms. I waited, watching the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded out again. Maybe a deer, I told myself, or a bear, but I'd grown up near the Smokies. I'd heard bears. I'd seen what they looked like when they moved through woods. This wasn't the same. I backed into the tent and stayed awake the rest of the night, holding my hatchet close and my flashlight in the other hand, the light off. By morning, the rain had slowed but never fully stopped. Mist curled low along the forest floor. Everything was damp, dark, and slick. I stepped out of the tent, careful where I walked. Then I saw it.
Boot prints.
In the mud, not mine. They came in from the southern tree line, curved around the edge of the tent. and then circled back. The treads were deep, spaced wide like whoever made them had a heavy step or was carrying something. I followed them a little way into the trees, just until I saw that they vanished into rocks and thicker brush. No telling where they came from or where they led. I didn't pack up. Not yet. I went back to the cabin frame and reinforced the tarp with more nails. My gut told me to get out, but I didn't want to leave it all half-finished. I told myself I'd stay one more night and then come back with a buddy to help finish it. Maybe bring a trail cam too. That evening, the rain picked up again. I stayed in the tent, flashlight in hand, hatchet beside me, listening. Just after 2 a.m., I heard something again, but this time it was closer. Fabric, something brushing against nylon. I held my breath. Then I saw the shadow, just outside the tent wall movement. Not a full figure, just a shift in the dim light from the clouds above. Like someone standing there, not moving. I didn't make a sound. For almost a full minute, it stayed still. Then, just as fast, it was gone. The brushing sound disappeared.
No footsteps.
No running. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I packed everything up. Sleeping bag, lantern, tools, and loaded them into the truck. My boots sank deep into the wet earth with every step. I didn't even check the tarp again. I just left. As I started the engine, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. A single boot print. On the tailgate, someone had stepped up onto it. Not recently, but at some point, maybe during the night. Maybe while I was walking the tree line the day before. I hadn't noticed. When I got back into town, I bought locks, motion lights, and a few cameras. I brought a friend back up there with me a few days later. We installed everything. Built the rest of the cabin together in 2 more trips. We didn't see anything strange after that. No more prints, no more shadows. But every time I sleep in that cabin now, even with the wood stove crackling and the door bolted, I keep the hatchet next to the bed. And I still think about that rainy night, about the way the tent wall moved, about the footsteps in the mud, the boot on the tailgate. Whoever it was, they were close enough to touch me, and I never even heard them. It was the fall of 2022 when I got the call that my ex-wife, Sandra, had died. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 5 years. We'd been married for 8, and it ended messy. Lawyers, bitterness, silence. But still, hearing that she'd passed in a car accident just outside of Spokane, Washington hit me in the chest harder than I expected. She was 38, no kids. No family left except for a half-brother in Oregon who didn't want anything to do with her or the funeral. That left me, strangely, as the one tying up loose ends. She still owned that small cabin out in northern Idaho, near Priest Lake. We used to go up there every few months when we were still married, just to get out of the city. After the divorce, she kept it. I hadn't been back since. But now that she was gone, and there was no will, no next of kin, the county said I was the closest thing to next of kin since we were still legally tied on some paperwork. They asked if I wanted to go out there and secure the place. Maybe clear out some of her personal stuff before they moved in with an estate agent. I didn't want to, but I also didn't like the idea of strangers pawing through her things, even if I didn't love her anymore. I packed up a few essentials into my truck and drove out the next morning. Took me the better part of 8 hours to get there from my place in western Montana. I pulled in just before dusk. The sky was already getting dark, and the clouds were thick, heavy with rain. The trees were darker than I remembered, towering over the winding dirt road that hadn't been maintained in a while. Branches scraped the side of my truck as I drove slow and careful. When I finally reached the clearing, I just sat there in the cab for a while. The cabin looked the same as I remembered it, but different in a way I couldn't explain. The roof lines sagged a little more. The wooden siding had faded. Moss clung to the base of the porch steps. The grass was high, and fallen branches were scattered across the yard. I could tell nobody had been up there in a long time. The air smelled like wet pine and old leaves. I stepped out of the truck and grabbed my backpack. The ground was soft and damp beneath my boots. There was no sound except for the wind in the trees. Not even birds. I walked up the steps, careful not to put weight on the loose board I remembered from years ago, and pulled the key out of the little tin can nailed under the railing. I opened the front door and stepped inside. It smelled like dust and something sweet that had gone bad. Maybe old food. The place was dark, even with the daylight still hanging on outside. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Either the power had been shut off or the lines were down. I wasn't surprised. I had a flashlight in my backpack and I clicked it on. The living room was how I remembered. 2 worn armchairs, a small couch, the wood stove in the corner. Shelves lined with old books and a few knickknacks. I looked around and saw her coat hanging on the hook near the door. A coffee cup half full sat on the table. It looked like she had been there recently before the accident. I made my way into the kitchen. Everything was quiet. The air had that still, dead feeling to it. The fridge was unplugged, door open, empty inside. Some cupboards were half open too. A mousetrap was on the counter, rusted shut. I checked the small bedroom down the hall. Bed unmade, suitcase open on the floor. Some of her clothes still folded inside. It was like she left in a rush, or expected to come back. I decided I'd stay the night. It was too dark and too late to turn around and drive back. I had brought a sleeping bag and a few supplies. I didn't want to touch too much of her stuff. I just needed to rest, and then I'd start cleaning out the place in the morning. The rain started around 10. I was sitting on the floor in the living room with a small camping lantern, reading an old book I found on the shelf. The rain pounded the roof steady, like it would never stop. Wind howled through the trees. The windows rattled a little, but I felt calm. Sad, but calm. Being in that cabin brought back memories, some good, some bad. I remembered her humming in the kitchen, the way she'd leave the bathroom light on at night, the way she used to write in her journal out on the porch. I hadn't thought of those little things in years. Around midnight, I heard something. It was sharp, faint, and out of place, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or rain. I turned off the lantern and held still. There it was again, a scraping sound somewhere outside the cabin, maybe on the porch. I got up slowly and moved toward the front window. I couldn't see much, just the trees swaying in the dark, but something felt off. That instinct in the back of your neck, the one that makes the hair stand up without knowing why. I waited a few minutes. The sound didn't come back. I figured maybe a branch fell or some animal wandered close. Still, I double-checked the door lock. Then I rolled out my sleeping bag and lay down near the wood stove. I didn't sleep much. Every little creak and thump made my eyes snap open. By morning, the rain had stopped. Fog clung low to the ground, swirling around the base of the trees. I made some instant coffee with a gas burner I brought and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap, sharp and wet. I walked around the side of the cabin to stretch my legs and saw something strange near the back corner. There were footprints, not mine. They circled around the back of the cabin and led toward the woods. They were shallow but fresh, not more than 12 hours old. And they weren't from boots, looked like worn-down sneakers. I followed them a few yards before they disappeared into the brush. I stood there for a minute, breathing hard. It didn't make sense. This place was miles from anything. No neighbors nearby, no hikers this time of year. No vehicles had come down the road after me. I would have seen or heard them. Who the hell had been out here? I went back inside and locked the door. I tried to tell myself maybe Sandra had a friend who came up sometimes. But then I remembered the coffee cup, the coat, the open suitcase. Had she been meeting someone up here before she died? Someone she didn't tell anyone about? I started packing her things into boxes. Mostly clothes, books, papers. Nothing valuable. I found a stack of old letters, none of them addressed. Just scraps of writing, mostly torn or half-finished. I read a few. They didn't make much sense. Ramblings. Mentions of someone watching her. Someone waiting in the woods. I didn't know if she wrote them during a rough time or if they meant something else. There was no signature, just her handwriting. By late afternoon, I was ready to leave. I loaded the boxes into the truck and gave the place one last walkthrough. As I stepped back onto the porch, I saw something new. A mark on the wood. It hadn't been there yesterday. It was a handprint, pressed in mud. Small, like a child's or a woman's. Fresh, right on the railing. I backed away slowly and got into the truck. I didn't drive off. I just sat there with the engine running, heart pounding. I felt like someone was watching me from the woods. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling was there, thick and real. I drove fast down that dirt road, branches whipping the sides, rocks kicking up under the tires. I didn't stop until I reached the paved highway an hour later. I pulled over, caught my breath, and finally let it out. That should have been the end of it. But that night, at the motel I stayed at back in town, I woke up at 2 a.m. to a noise at my window. I was on the second floor. I didn't check. Couldn't. I sat frozen in bed for an hour before falling back asleep. A few days later, I got a call from the county. They said someone had broken into the cabin after I left. The front door was wide open, furniture overturned, stuff missing. They thought it was just some vagrant or addict looking for shelter. But I knew better. I told them to lock the place up. I wanted nothing more to do with it. Months passed. Winter came and went. I tried to forget, but sometimes I still see that handprint in my mind. Still hear that sound on the porch. I never figured out who was out there or why Sandra wrote those letters. Maybe she was being watched. Maybe someone followed her to that cabin and stayed hidden until I showed up. Maybe they never left. I sold the cabin through the county without ever going back. I burned her letters. I don't keep pictures of her anymore, but sometimes I think about what she must have gone through, alone in that place. If someone had been out there with her, watching, waiting. She died in a car accident, they said, but no one ever explained why she was driving so fast that night, or why she was going the opposite direction of town. I think she was running. I think she knew someone was out there, and I think when I was up there, they weren't finished yet. That was the last time I ever stayed in the woods alone. I started my shift just after sunrise on a clear morning in late September of 1998. The air was crisp, the kind that stings your cheeks when you breathe too hard, and the leaves in the Rockies were starting to turn gold and red. I was Jake Reynolds, a park ranger with about 6 years on the job. At 28, I knew these mountains well. The trails, the animals, and the dangers we all faced in this wilderness. My post for the next week was a small ranger cabin deep in the backcountry of the park, miles from any road. The cabin was nothing fancy. It was a simple wooden structure with a propane heater, a small stove, a bunk bed, and a desk with a radio. I was the only ranger stationed there for this entire week, responsible for patrolling the surrounding trails, monitoring wildlife, and keeping an eye on hikers who might get lost or run into trouble. That morning, I loaded up my backpack with basic supplies, extra batteries, food, water, maps, and my old .357 revolver, just in case. The forest surrounding the cabin was thick with pines and firs, the smell of damp earth mixing with pine sap and fallen leaves. The mountains rose steeply around me, shadows already long in the early hours. The first few hours went as usual. I checked the nearby trail markers, made notes about fallen trees blocking certain paths, and marked animal tracks near the river. Elk, deer, and the occasional bear left their signs, but nothing out of the ordinary. I had walked these woods dozens of times before and felt comfortable in their quiet isolation. As afternoon fell, I made my way back to the cabin to rest and eat. I lit a fire in the small stone fireplace, the warm orange flames licking the darkening room. The crackle and pop of burning wood was a familiar comfort after a day outside. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling branches and sending dry leaves swirling around the cabin. It was late afternoon when I heard the first strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but the sound was different, soft footsteps crunching on dead leaves, deliberate and slow. They didn't belong to any animal I knew. No bird call, no rustle of squirrels or deer. I stood by the window, watching into the deepening forest. The shadows were growing long, the sun sinking behind the peaks, and the trees looked like black silhouettes. The footsteps stopped suddenly, as if whoever or whatever it was had heard me watching. I reached for the radio on the desk and flipped it on. The static buzzed in my ears. I called out, "Base, this is Ranger Reynolds. Anyone out there?" Only silence answered me. The radio worked fine during the day. Something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The forest seemed darker now, the trees looming like giant sentinels. I moved slowly toward the direction of the noise, my boots crunching on the gravel path. Nothing. No sign of anyone. I kept walking around the cabin's perimeter, flashlight sweeping through the trees. The only movement was a small group of rabbits darting away into the brush. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had passed nearby, but with the park closed to visitors for the season, it didn't make much sense. Back inside, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. The cabin was solid, old but sturdy. I set the propane heater to a low hum to keep the place warm overnight. Night fell fully, and with it came silence. The usual sounds of the forest, owl calls, distant coyote howls, the rustle of wind through the treetops, were muffled, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then, around 10 p.m., I heard it again. Slow footsteps on the gravel path outside. This time, they were closer. I grabbed my revolver and crept to the window. A figure was moving just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out much in the dark. Just a shadow, tall and slow-moving. My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept calm. I flicked on the porch light. The figure froze for a moment, then disappeared behind the trees. I stepped outside, flashlight and gun ready. The night was still except for the sound of my own breathing and the beam of my light cutting through the dark. I called out softly, "Hello? Who's there?" No answer. No movement. I decided to check the radio again. The static was worse now, cutting out every few seconds. Felt like I was completely isolated. I walked slowly toward the forest edge, shining the light between the trees. A few feet into the shadows, I saw a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. It was dark green, like the jacket I issued to park rangers. A chill ran down my spine. How could someone in ranger gear be sneaking around my cabin at night? Was it a lost hiker or something else? I moved cautiously back toward the cabin. Suddenly, a branch snapped loudly behind me. I spun around with my flashlight and gun aimed. No one. My heart raced. I stood still, listening. More footsteps. Closer now. I backed toward the cabin, fumbling with the keys. My hands shook as I locked the door behind me. I went straight to the phone line. Dead. The phone wouldn't work. No cell service this deep in the woods. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing. The night seemed endless. Then the pounding started on the cabin door. Heavy, urgent thuds that shook the old wood. I gripped my revolver and edged toward the door, but I didn't open it. The pounding stopped suddenly. Silence. Then a whisper of movement around the cabin perimeter. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the window again. The beam caught a figure moving quickly between trees on the far side. I grabbed my coat and backpack, stuffed some food and water into my pockets, and prepared to leave. The only way out was the narrow trail back toward the ranger station miles away. If whoever was out there wanted to get me, staying put wasn't an option. I stepped outside into the cold night air, careful to stay in the shadows. The forest was alive with sounds, but I kept my eyes fixed on the trail ahead. I walked quickly, hearing footsteps behind me, sometimes close, sometimes fading, like I was being followed but the person didn't want to get caught. The night dragged on. The trail twisted through thick trees and over rocky ground. I stumbled once, catching myself against a pine tree. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of the ranger station lights in the distance, my safe point after a long, terrifying night. When I finally reached the station, I locked the door behind me and called for backup. The next morning, a search party combed the area around my cabin. They found no signs of the figure, no tracks, nothing except the torn piece of jacket. I never figured out who was out there that night. Maybe someone lost or someone who didn't want to be found. But I knew one thing for sure. In the wilderness, when the night falls, you're never as alone as you think. I never expected to spend a night in a place like Hollow Creek. Not the graveyard part, not the cabin, not anything about it. But when my car broke down near the small town of Pine Ridge, Idaho, late in October of 1987, I didn't have much choice. I was 28 then, traveling alone after a long stretch of freelance photography work. The mountains were cold already, with that sharp bite in the air that meant winter was on its way, and I had no phone, no way to call for help. Just me, the dark, and an old, weather-beaten cabin sitting near a forgotten graveyard. I had been driving for hours through the winding roads that cut through the dense forest surrounding Pine Ridge. The town itself was barely a dot on any map. A few dozen homes, a diner, a general store, and, as I soon discovered, the Hollow Creek Cemetery. It was an old graveyard, surrounded by a rusty wire fence that sagged in places and wooden posts worn by decades of rain and snow. The gravestones inside were cracked, some leaning so far that they looked like they might topple any second. The cabin stood on the edge of the cemetery, only a few yards from the nearest gravestone. I noticed it by chance when my car sputtered and died just past a bend in the road. I had hoped for a phone or a house nearby, but this was all there was. A solitary cabin with peeling white paint, shuttered windows, and a sagging porch. The roof was partially covered in moss, and the chimney leaned slightly to one side like it had survived a storm or two. I decided to take my chances and walk over. The sun was already setting, and shadows stretched long and thin through the trees. The cold settled in my bones as I moved closer. I wasn't superstitious, but standing that close to a graveyard, I couldn't help but feel a weight pressing down on my chest. A kind of quiet unease that came not from ghosts or stories, but from the sheer silence of the place. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, and I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my boots. Inside, the cabin was dark and dusty, filled with the stale smell of old wood and something faintly sour that I couldn't place. There was a small stove in the corner, a table with a few broken chairs, and a rickety bed against the far wall. I found a box of matches on a shelf and lit a lantern I spotted. The flickering light revealed cracked wallpaper peeling at the edges, a faded photograph hanging crookedly on the wall. A man in a suit standing beside a woman in a wedding dress. They both looked serious, the kind of serious that comes from hard years and harder lives. I felt an odd sense of history in the place, like the cabin was holding its breath, waiting for someone who had long since left. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I spent the next hour trying to get my car to start again. The cold was getting worse, and night had fully fallen, turning the woods outside into a dark, shifting wall of shadows. The only light came from the stars and the weak beam of my flashlight. No luck with the car. I returned to the cabin and decided to make the best of it. I found a stack of dry wood near the porch and brought it inside, managing to light the stove. The warmth spread slowly, pushing back the chill that clung to the cabin's corners. I sat down on the edge of the bed, looking out the window toward the graveyard. The tombstones caught the moonlight, their white surfaces glowing faintly against the blackness. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. The night felt heavy, like the kind of silence that presses in on you until every little sound seems louder than it should be. That's when I noticed movement in the graveyard. Not something supernatural or strange, but a man walking slowly between the stones, head down. At first, I thought maybe I was seeing things, tired and cold as I was, but he moved steadily, methodically. He was dressed in dark clothes, a coat too heavy for this time of year, and he carried a bag. I watched him from the window, unsure what to make of it. After a moment, he stopped by a large stone, bent down, and dug with his hands in the soft earth. My heart thudded hard. What was he doing here? Was he some kind of grave digger? It was odd for someone to be working in a graveyard so late at night and without any tools. His movements were careful but urgent, like he was trying not to be seen. I debated whether to call out or leave, but something told me to stay quiet. The man finished digging, reached into his bag, and pulled out a small box. He lowered it gently into the hole and covered it with dirt, patting the ground down carefully afterward. Then, just as quietly, he stood up and started walking toward the edge of the graveyard, his eyes scanning the dark woods beyond. That was the moment I noticed the scar on his left cheek, pale against his dark skin. He disappeared into the trees before I could make sense of anything. I stood frozen, the lantern in my hand flickering wildly in the cold draft. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the distant sounds of the forest. I tried to sleep, but every shadow in the room seemed to move. Every noise outside set my nerves on edge. At one point, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I held my breath, waiting, but no one came to the door. The footsteps faded into the woods, and I was left alone again with my thoughts and the cold. Morning came slowly, the light creeping through the cracked window. I was exhausted but knew I had to get moving. I walked outside and looked around the graveyard, but there was no sign of the hole or the box. The earth was undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. That's when I spotted it. A small, fresh mound of earth beside an old tombstone. The dirt was darker, still loose. I knelt down and brushed away some leaves. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, was the box the man had buried. I opened it carefully and found a handful of old photographs, yellowed letters, and a small locket. Reading the letters, I pieced together a story of loss, grief, and secrets. The man in the graveyard wasn't some criminal or threat. He was burying memories, hiding a painful past from the world. I stayed a little longer that day, making sure my car was fixed by a kindly mechanic in Pine Ridge. I left the cabin behind, but the image of that man, alone in the graveyard with his burden, stayed with me. I never found out who he was, or why he chose that cold, forgotten place to bury his past. But the story wasn't one of ghosts or horrors. It was a story about people, about pain and the quiet ways we try to heal. That night, in that cabin by the graveyard, I learned that sometimes the scariest places aren't haunted by spirits. They're haunted by the weight of things left unsaid, by the things people bury deep inside themselves. And maybe, in the end, the real courage is just facing that truth. It was the fall of 2016 when I decided to take a break from my routine life in Columbus, Ohio. I was 34 at the time, single, and working a desk job that never gave me a moment of real peace. Everything felt like noise, phones ringing, emails piling up, my lower back hurting from hours of sitting. I didn't even have the energy to keep up with friends anymore. So when my boss said I had 2 weeks of vacation left to use or lose, I packed my things and drove out alone into northern Michigan, toward a cabin my cousin owned near a place called Baldwin. He hardly ever used it and was fine with me staying for as long as I wanted. The cabin sat off a rough gravel road tucked back a quarter mile into a patch of woods. It wasn't big, just one bedroom, a small kitchen with an old gas stove, a tiny bathroom with rusty water, and a dusty living area. But to me, it felt like exactly what I needed. No cell reception, no internet, just the sound of the wind moving through tall pine trees and a fire pit out back. The first few days were exactly what I hoped for. I woke up when the light came through the windows, not to an alarm clock. I made coffee in a percolator. I walked the trails behind the cabin. I even brought an old book I never got around to reading. The air smelled clean. My shoulders dropped. I wasn't checking my phone every minute. I was finally breathing like a normal person again. But by the 5th night, something shifted. That day had been colder. The wind came through louder than before, like it had picked up from somewhere farther north. I had spent the afternoon walking deeper into the forest behind the cabin, following a faint trail that looked like it hadn't been used in years. At one point, I noticed an old, rusted fence half swallowed by the undergrowth. It was wrapped in vines, and behind it sat a collapsed wooden structure, maybe an old shed or barn. I didn't go near it. I just stood there for a while, staring at it, before turning back toward the cabin. When I got back that evening, I made a fire inside, cooked up some canned chili, and listened to the radio, which only got one station, some country music channel that kept repeating the same songs. Around 9 or so, I turned the radio off and just sat there listening to the fire crackle. The wind had picked up more by then. The trees outside groaned like they were shifting on their own legs. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I couldn't shake the image of that old structure I saw in the woods. My mind kept replaying the way it leaned to one side, the way it looked like it had been clawed at by time and weather. I figured it was just my imagination playing games because I was finally away from the noise.
No distractions.
Just my head talking to itself. But then I heard something outside. It started as a crunch. Not the wind, not the trees. It was weight, footsteps, slow, like someone stepping on dry twigs and leaves. Then nothing for a few seconds. Then another crack. I froze. My heart kicked up so fast it was all I could hear. I stayed in bed under the covers, barely breathing. I didn't have a weapon on me, just a pocket knife in the kitchen drawer and a small hatchet I used for firewood. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but something about the rhythm of the steps said otherwise. They weren't quick or nervous like an animal's. They were deliberate, careful. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first gray light came through the window, I finally moved. I got up and peeked through the curtain. Nothing. The woods looked the same, still, quiet. I stepped outside in my boots and walked around the cabin. There were marks in the dirt by the side window, flat spots pressed down like someone had stood there. A person would have had a clear view into the room where I slept. I stared at the marks for a long time. Then I grabbed the hatchet from the woodpile and started checking every window, every door. Everything was locked. Nothing was broken, but I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. I thought about packing up that morning, driving back to Ohio, but something about leaving felt wrong, like I'd run back to my old life even more exhausted than I was before. So I stayed. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I made those marks myself earlier and forgot. The 6th night was colder. The fire kept the cabin warm enough, but I felt uneasy. I moved my sleeping bag into the living room, closer to the fireplace. I kept the hatchet next to me. I even propped a chair against the front door like people do in movies. When I finally fell asleep, it wasn't for long. I woke up sometime after midnight, not to a sound, not to a dream, just the feeling again, that strange pressure in the air. I stayed still and listened. For a few seconds, nothing. Then I heard it again. Crunch, crunch, slower this time, coming from the side of the cabin, then stopping beneath the window. I held my breath so long my lungs started to burn. I didn't move, didn't blink. The footsteps started again, circling slowly toward the front door. Then I heard the faintest sound, metal against wood, like a screwdriver twisting, trying to find a weak spot. I sat up and reached for the hatchet. My hands were slick with sweat. I stood behind the door, barely breathing, just listening. The sound stopped. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night again. When the sun came up, I found scratches near the bottom of the door frame. Not deep, just small slices like someone had tried to wedge something between the door and the frame. The trail leading away from the cabin had been stepped on. Big, flat prints going off into the woods. I started packing. I loaded up my bag, my gear, everything I could carry. But when I got into my truck and turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even click. Battery was dead. It had worked fine the day before. The hood was cold. No signs of tampering, but something wasn't right. I got out and opened the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but even I could see something was off. One of the battery cables looked like it had been yanked out. Not chewed, not corroded, just pulled. I stood there for a long time staring at it. Then I went back inside and locked the door again. I still had canned food, still had water. I figured I could stay one more night and hike out in the morning. I knew the trail well enough by now to get back to the main road. It would be about 5 miles. I could do it at first light. That last night was the worst. I didn't light a fire, didn't want any light coming from the windows. I sat in the dark, listening. I kept thinking about those prints, the way they circled, the slow footsteps. Whoever it was, they had been watching the cabin for at least 2 nights, maybe longer. I kept replaying everything in my head. Had they seen me walk the trail? Had they followed me back? Were they living in that old structure I saw in the woods? Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time it was closer. I felt it before I heard it, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Then a slow creak came from the back wall. Not inside, outside, something brushing against the siding. Then a tap on the window, soft, measured. 1 tap, then another, then silence. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, hatchet in hand, back to the wall. I stayed like that for over an hour. Every sound felt sharp. I could hear my own heartbeat. I didn't blink, didn't move. By the time the sun finally started to rise, I was already packed. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the door behind me, and took off down the trail at a steady pace. I didn't look back. When I reached the road, I flagged down a county worker in a truck. He didn't ask many questions, just gave me a ride into town. I called a tow company and had them check the cabin later that day. They said the battery cable had been pulled loose. No signs of vandalism inside the cabin. Nothing taken. But I didn't go back. I never told my cousin the full story. I just said the place felt too remote for me. He offered to sell it later that year, and I told him he should. I don't know if he ever did. Since then, I haven't spent another night alone in the woods. I still go hiking, still take long walks through quiet places. But cabins? No, not anymore. Not after that. Because the scariest thing I learned up there wasn't about ghosts or strange creatures. It was that someone somewhere, had been watching me for days, not saying anything, not taking anything, just watching, waiting. I don't know what they wanted. I don't care. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw, and I never want to see it again. I was 31 the year this happened. That was 2021 in late September, and I remember it all clearly because it was about a week after my dad's funeral. I'd been feeling restless, like I needed space from everything. I wasn't dealing with grief well. Too many people in town knew my family, so I couldn't go anywhere without someone stopping me to talk about my dad. I appreciated it, but I needed air. I needed silence. So, I packed up a cooler, some gear, and drove out to a place I hadn't seen in years. My uncle's old farm in rural Nebraska, just east of Broken Bow. My uncle Darren used to own about 80 acres of mostly pasture and wheat, with a small off-grid cabin at the far western edge of the property, near the old windbreak. He'd passed away when I was in my teens, and the land had been sitting empty since then. My dad never sold it, said he wanted to hold onto it out of respect. I hadn't been out there since I was maybe 15 or 16, but I remembered the layout. Dirt road past a rusted gate, winding trail down into a thicket, then about half a mile of overgrown path that led to the cabin. It was a boxy thing, no electricity,
No plumbing.
just a wood stove, a couple old metal bunks, and a rain barrel by the back porch. I figured it'd be the perfect place to stay for a few days, just to get away from people. No phone service, no internet, just open sky and cold air. I got there around 4 p.m. on a Wednesday, after a 4-hour drive. I parked my truck by the fence line, then hiked in. It took longer than I thought because the trail had overgrown badly. Thorns scratched my legs, and I kept losing my footing on rocks and soft dirt. But eventually, I saw the cabin up ahead through the trees. It looked even smaller than I remembered. Tilted slightly, paint flaking off the walls, windows coated in grime. I had a strange feeling when I stepped onto the porch. Not fear, just an odd heaviness, like the place didn't want me there. I brushed it off, opened the creaky door, and set my gear inside. Dust was thick on everything. Mouse droppings in the corners, a nest up in the rafters. But it was still standing, and the roof didn't seem to leak. I spent that first night cleaning up. Swept the floors, cleared a space on one of the bunks, filled the water basin from the rain barrel. I heated a can of beans on a little portable stove I brought and ate while sitting on the back steps. The stars were out, and the wind was moving through the trees. It was quiet, too quiet maybe, but that's what I came for. I didn't sleep well, not because of fear or anything, just because the bunk was hard and the night was cold. I woke up around 3 a.m. and couldn't get back to sleep. I remember sitting there in the dark, wrapped in my coat, just listening. There's a sound you forget until you're far enough from civilization. The way real silence feels thick, like you can hear your own blood moving. I thought I heard something moving out in the grass once or twice, just faint crunching, probably deer or a raccoon. I told myself that. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the property. I followed the old fence line, kicked at rocks, stood and looked across empty fields. I saw crows. I saw deer tracks. At one point, I thought I saw someone standing way off in the trees, but when I blinked, it was just a dark patch between trunks. My nerves were up, but I kept moving. There was a rusted-out tractor half buried in weeds on the southern edge of the pasture. I stood on it and looked back toward the cabin. From that spot, it looked like a small dot surrounded by green and brown. I wondered how many people had stood on this exact machine decades ago, looking out across their land. I found something strange that afternoon. About 200 yards north of the cabin, near a dried-out stream bed, I came across a buried piece of metal. At first, I thought it was just junk, an old piece of fencing or farm equipment. But the more I looked, the more it seemed deliberate. It was rectangular, only about a foot across and flat like a hatch. Most of it was under dirt, but I could see a thin, rusted handle sticking out. I scraped away the soil with my boots and then my hands until I could see the whole thing. It was definitely a hatch. It looked like it was part of some old storm shelter or root cellar, but I didn't remember one being here. Even when I was a kid and spent time running around these woods, I never saw it. There were no hinges on top, just that one handle. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I figured it was rusted shut. Still, it felt weird to find something like that and not remember it. My uncle never mentioned anything about a cellar. I'd never seen plans or anything in my dad's office about a structure being buried out here. I went back to the cabin, a little uneasy now. I told myself it was probably just old storage, something they used decades ago and forgot. But still, it sat in my head like a stone. That night, I didn't sleep well again. I thought I heard movement outside, more definite this time, like something stepping carefully near the porch. But when I looked through the foggy window, I didn't see anything. On the third day, I went back to the hatch with a crowbar and small sledge I kept in the truck. I hacked at the edges until I could wedge the crowbar in. The metal screamed when I pried it, but eventually, it gave. A sharp smell came out of it, like mold and wet earth. I lifted the hatch and saw a ladder leading down into the dark. I stood there a long time just looking. The ladder went down maybe 10 or 12 feet into what looked like a small room. The light didn't reach far. I dropped a rock down and listened. It hit something soft, maybe dirt or wood. I didn't go down. Instead, I went back to the cabin and sat on the steps, staring at the trees. My thoughts were scrambled. I didn't know if I wanted to leave or explore it. Something told me I shouldn't go down there, but something else, curiosity or stupidity, said I had to. Around 5 p.m., I packed a flashlight and gloves and went back. I tied a rope to a tree nearby and looped it around my waist, just in case. I climbed down slowly, testing each rung. The smell got stronger the deeper I went. Mildew, rot, something metallic. At the bottom, my boots hit dirt. I swept the flashlight across the space. It was a small bunker, maybe 12 feet across. The walls were made of concrete, damp and cracked. There were shelves along one side with cans and dusty boxes. Some had writing on them, old labels, faded ink. I saw a small cot with a blanket still folded on top and a broken lantern on the floor. But what caught my attention was something in the corner. It was a metal cabinet padlocked shut. The lock was rusted, barely holding. I broke it with the crowbar and opened the doors. Inside were files. Dozens of old folders, water-stained and fragile. Pulled one out and opened it. Inside were photographs, all black and white. People, men and women, mostly close-ups of faces. Some were labeled with names. Others had numbers instead. The more I looked, the more disturbed I felt. One photo showed a man bound to a chair. Another showed someone lying in a bed, eyes closed, mouth open like they were screaming. None of it made sense. I found a sheet of paper with my uncle's handwriting on it. I recognized it immediately. He had a weird loop in his capital LS. The paper said, "They don't check here. Keep them for now. Burn if I die." I don't know how long I stood there reading. My hands were shaking. The flashlight beam jittered across the wall. I felt cold, even though the bunker was stuffy. Kept thinking, what was this? What had he done? I put everything back and climbed out, heart pounding. I kicked dirt over the hatch and dragged branches across it to hide it. Then I went straight to the cabin and packed my stuff. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit down. I stood with my back to the door until the sun came up. Every sound outside made me flinch. I kept imagining things, my uncle dragging people out here, hiding them, hurting them. The photographs kept flashing in my mind. I left at dawn. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. I didn't know how. I didn't know if I should. But eventually, I called a friend of mine in Lincoln who worked with the sheriff's office. I told him I found something weird on my family's land, and I wanted him to look at it. I gave them the location and stayed in town during the investigation. They called me 2 days later to say the bunker existed, just like I described. And there were photos, files. They found enough to launch an inquiry into my uncle, even though he'd been dead for nearly 20 years. In the weeks that followed, I learned more than I ever wanted to. Apparently, my uncle had been involved with a group in the 1980s that ran illegal medical experiments on people. Some homeless, some from state hospitals, all done off the books. They used isolated places to work, cabins, farms, abandoned buildings. He wasn't a doctor, but he helped set up the sites. He kept records, probably blackmail, insurance. The land was quietly seized, the evidence sealed. The sheriff told me, off the record, that they couldn't prove everything, but what they had was enough to connect some missing persons cases from 30 years ago. I never went back to that cabin. I don't think I ever will. My dad never knew, or at least I hope he didn't. I think that would have killed him more than the cancer did. I try to forget it, but sometimes at night, when it's too quiet and I'm lying awake, I still hear that metal hatch creak open in my head. I still see those faces in the dark, and I wonder how many more places like that are still out there. I'm not sure why I'm writing this. Maybe because I haven't told anyone about what happened, and it's just been building up inside. I was never someone who believed in anything weird, and I still don't. I don't think there was anything magical or supernatural about what I experienced. It was just a bad situation in a quiet place. One that could have gone very wrong if I hadn't trusted my gut. It happened in the summer of 2017. I was 32 at the time, living alone in Liverpool and working a boring IT job that kept me in front of a screen too long. I was burned out, sitting indoors every day, my eyes sore and brain foggy, answering emails, fixing code. I just couldn't do it anymore. I told my boss I needed a short break, and he didn't argue. I booked a week off and decided to get out of the city. I didn't want to go anywhere fancy. I didn't want beaches or hotels or people. I wanted something quiet and out of the way. I went online and started looking at remote cabins or cottages to rent. I eventually found this place in Northumberland, somewhere out near Kielder Forest. It was advertised as a secluded hillside cabin for solo retreats, and the photos showed a wooden cabin, old but clean looking, nestled in thick green woods with no other buildings in sight. The listing said it had power, running water, and even a wood burner. It looked like the kind of place where I could just sit, read, cook simple food, and not hear anything but birds and wind in the trees. I booked it for 6 nights. It was cheap too, cheaper than I expected, really, but I wasn't gonna argue with that. The drive out there took around 4 hours. I left early in the morning, stopped for petrol and snacks along the way, and reached the narrow country lanes by early afternoon. The last bit of the drive was on gravel, and my small car didn't love it, but I made it. The cabin was exactly like the pictures. It stood on a small clearing just off a dirt track that twisted into trees and vanished. There was a thin stream running nearby, and the air smelled like pine and damp soil. I didn't see a single soul on the road up. No neighbors, no other cabins. Just trees and silence. I got out, stretched my legs, and looked around. Felt peaceful. Felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. The key was under a flower pot by the door, just like the owner had said in the confirmation email. The cabin had a small front porch with a single wooden chair. The inside was simple. Wooden walls, a basic kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, and a narrow bed against the back wall. There was a small bathroom with an electric shower and toilet. All the windows had working latches. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and no mobile signal. It was exactly what I wanted. The first couple of days were calm. I slept in, made breakfast, walked the trails that branched off from the clearing, and listened to the wind in the trees. I brought a few books and a notepad, and I even started writing again, something I hadn't done since university. It was like my brain had space again. But around the third night, things changed. I remember it clearly because I just finished dinner. Eggs on toast, nothing fancy. And I was sitting outside on the porch with a blanket, watching the sky turn dark. The air was cool but not cold, and I was feeling peaceful. That kind of rare silence where you can hear your own heartbeat and nothing else. Then I saw something. Out past the clearing, just beyond the first row of trees, there was movement. It wasn't an animal. I could tell right away. It was slow, upright, person. At first, I thought maybe it was the owner or a farmer passing through. But the figure didn't walk like someone out for a stroll. They didn't seem to be moving toward anything. They were just standing half hidden behind a tree. I leaned forward, trying to make it out better. The figure was tall and thin. Female, I thought, judging by the way the hair hung straight down. The light was almost gone, so I couldn't see her face. She stood there, partly behind the tree, not moving. I stood up, unsure what to do. I waved once, just in case she hadn't seen me. No response. She didn't move. I watched her for another full minute. Then I blinked, and when I looked again, she was gone. It unsettled me. Not because she disappeared, she could have just stepped back into the trees, but because of the way she was standing. Not walking, not waving, just watching. I stayed outside for a while longer, pretending I wasn't bothered, but I was. I went back inside, locked the door, and closed all the curtains. The next morning, I tried to explain it away. Maybe she was a hiker who got turned around. Maybe she was looking for someone. Still, it didn't sit right. I decided to explore the area in that direction. I took the narrow trail that led toward where I'd seen her. There were no paths or clearings out there, just thick trees, uneven ground, and a carpet of old leaves and pine needles.
No footprints.
No sign of anyone. That night, I kept the curtains closed. By the fifth day, I started to feel uneasy. Not scared exactly, but alert. I kept looking out the windows, listening. I told myself I was being paranoid, that being alone in the woods was playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. On the fifth night, I woke up at around 3 a.m. I didn't know what woke me. There was no sound, no light, but I was suddenly alert. I sat up in bed and listened. Nothing, just the low creak of the trees outside. Then I heard it, a very faint, rhythmic crunch. Footsteps. They were slow and careful, as if someone was walking just outside on the grass. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, crept to the front window, and pulled back the curtain a few inches. There she was, standing in the clearing, not moving. Her back was to me. She was facing the woods, not the cabin, but she was close enough that I could see her shape clearly. Long coat, pale hands, thin shoulders. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, like she was listening for something in the woods. I stood there frozen for a full minute. Then I blinked again, and she was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin looking for footprints. There weren't any. The grass was a little damp from dew, but I couldn't find any signs that someone had walked through. I should have left then. I know that now, but I stayed. I didn't want to feel like I was running away over nothing. I told myself that maybe it was a dream or sleep paralysis, but I'd been standing, awake. I remembered every detail. On the last night, things came to a head. I was in bed, reading with a flashlight since I didn't want to leave the lights on. Couldn't relax. I kept thinking I'd hear those footsteps again. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard something. Not footsteps this time. Tap. It was coming from the side of the cabin. Just one tap, then another. I turned off the flashlight and got out of bed. I walked slowly to the side window and looked out. She was standing right there, by the tree closest to the cabin. Her face was turned toward the window, toward me. This time I saw her face clearly. She wasn't old, but she looked worn. Her skin looked pale and tight, and her eyes were wide open. Too wide, unblinking. Her mouth was closed, and she wasn't smiling or frowning, just staring. Her coat was soaked at the hem, like she'd been walking through wet grass for hours. She didn't move. I stepped back, heart hammering. I didn't want to look again, but I did. She was still there. I don't know how long we stood like that. Her outside, me inside. But at some point, I looked away for a second, and when I looked back, she was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I packed my bag and sat by the door with a kitchen knife in my lap until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I grabbed everything, threw it into the car, and drove. I didn't stop until I was halfway back to Liverpool. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never reported it. What would I even say? That a woman stood near my cabin a couple of nights in a row? That she didn't talk or do anything? It wasn't illegal to stand in the woods, but I couldn't get her face out of my mind. That blank expression, those wide eyes, that soaked coat. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I went online and searched for anything about that area. Missing persons, hikers, crimes. I didn't find much, but I did find an old article from 2013 about a woman who had gone missing in the woods near Kielder. Her name was Janet Arnold, 41. Last seen leaving her job at a care home in Bellingham. Her car was found parked near one of the fire roads that wind through the forest. They never found her. The photo showed a thin woman with long dark hair, pale skin, and a serious expression. I don't know if it was her. All I know is I will never go back to that place. Something was wrong there. Not supernatural, just wrong. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was watching to see if I could help her. Or maybe she wasn't looking for help at all. Maybe she was looking for someone to follow. I'm just glad I left when I did. And I don't plan on going back into the woods alone ever again. I was 37 when I decided to take a break from everything. This was in late October of 2021. I'd been working construction in Flagstaff, Arizona, since my 20s. Same job sites, same schedule, same early mornings with my thermos and sore back. I wasn't unhappy, but I was tired. I felt it more every year. So when the company got bought out and offered severance to those willing to step away early, I took it. I figured I'd use the money to disappear for a little while and figure out what to do next. I didn't want to fly anywhere, didn't want to deal with cities. I just wanted to be away. I found the cabin on an old listing through a friend of a friend. It was owned by some guy from New Mexico who'd moved out to Colorado years ago. The cabin was still in his family, but they didn't use it anymore. It sat about 20 miles outside of Shiprock, just north of the reservation line. Real remote, no cell reception, no paved road, just a rough dirt path that snaked through the desert. I paid him $400 to use it for a couple of weeks. It was basic, no running water, just a tank you refilled from a big blue barrel, and an old propane stove with a crooked knob. The bathroom was an outhouse out back with a crooked seat and spiders. But I didn't mind. I'd grown up in areas like this. I brought in my own drinking water, food, and camping gear. Even had a small generator and solar panel I could use if I needed to charge something. I arrived just before sunset. It was already cold. The high desert air turns sharp fast in the fall, especially when the wind picks up like it did that day. The land was wide and open around me, scattered with sagebrush and those low rolling mounds of dirt that make the whole place look like it's breathing slowly. The red rocks to the east caught the last light like embers. The cabin was smaller than I expected. One main room, a little kitchenette, and a low ceiling. There was a cot in the corner and a table with 2 old chairs. Most of the windows had warped frames and let the wind through in tiny cold breaths. I unpacked slowly, made a small meal, and went outside to stand under the stars. There's nothing like a desert sky on a clear night. The stars feel so thick they seem like they're pressing down on you. That first night, it was dead silent. No traffic, no barking dogs, not even crickets. The next few days passed quietly. I hiked around, made small repairs to the cabin, and kept a fire going in the little iron stove when the cold came in at night. I liked being alone. I didn't even think much about the skinwalker stories I'd heard over the years, mostly from old-timers and folks who grew up on the res. I never believed in that stuff. But there were some things that started happening after the 4th night that I still can't explain in a normal way. Not supernatural, just strange in a human, too close kind of way. It started with tracks. I'd gone out that morning to check the water barrel. It was half empty, which was normal. What wasn't normal was the set of footprints I found leading around the side of the cabin. They were barefoot, human.
No shoes, no socks.
Just bare feet in the cold, dry dirt. They looked fresh, too. I followed them for a few yards until they vanished in the brush. It gave me a weird feeling, but I brushed it off. Maybe someone from a nearby trailer or another old property had wandered through. It was unlikely, but I didn't want to spook myself. There was no sign of anyone else. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things. A faint clicking sound. Not like metal, more like teeth. I thought maybe a coyote was nosing around the cabin. I had a shovel by the door and kept it close just in case. In the morning, I found something strange at the edge of the porch. It was a bone, small and clean. Looked like a chicken bone or something similar. But I hadn't eaten anything like that, and there were no remains of any animal around. Just that one little bone, almost like someone placed it there. I started to feel uneasy after that. The air felt different, not haunted, just watched. The next night, I decided to stay up. I turned off the propane lantern and kept the cabin dark. I sat near the small front window watching, listening. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard movement near the outhouse. Something soft, like someone trying not to be heard. Then a shape moved across the moonlit yard. It was fast, low to the ground at first, but then it stood up. It was a man. I could see that much. Naked or close to it. Pale skin, thin arms and legs. He was standing with his back to me, not moving, just staring at the dark line of hills in the distance. I froze. My first thought was drugs. Meth or something worse. Maybe someone lost their mind out here, wandered off, and ended up at the wrong place. I stayed crouched by the window, barely breathing. He turned around slowly. I saw his face. It wasn't inhuman, but it was wrong. His mouth was open, not wide, just parted slightly, like he was trying to smell something. His eyes didn't look at the cabin. They just drifted upward, toward the stars. And his skin had this dull, grayish tone like he'd been in the cold too long. His ribs were sharp and his legs looked too long. I didn't move. I didn't grab the lantern. I just waited. After maybe 2 minutes, he walked off. Not quickly, just wandered into the dark, back toward the brush.
I stayed up till sunrise.
When the sky got light, I went outside with my shovel and a flashlight. No sign of him, but the prints were there again. Barefoot, circling the cabin, and this time, scratches on the side of the wood. Not deep, just small marks like fingernails or small stones dragged along the surface. I thought about packing up, but I told myself maybe it was some local guy living off-grid. Still scary, but not supernatural. I told myself it was just bad luck. I stayed another night. That was a mistake. The generator stopped working sometime after 9 p.m. It had gas and I checked the plug, but it just wouldn't run. No light, no charge. I used a flashlight and lit a couple of candles I had stashed. Then I heard it again, that clicking sound. Closer this time. I turned off the flashlight and blew out the candles. Sat in the dark. My breathing felt too loud. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would shake the floorboards. There was a slow dragging sound on the porch. Then soft footsteps. A long pause. Then the handle of the front door moved slightly. Just once. A soft rattle. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I made my decision. I packed everything, threw it all into the truck, didn't even bother organizing it. I went to check around the property one last time. That's when I found the skin. It was hanging on a branch behind the outhouse. Looked like animal hide, stretched out and dried. But it was too thin, too smooth. It looked almost like human skin. No hair, no fur. Just pale and dry, like something peeled off and left to cure. I got in the truck and drove. The dirt road was rougher than I remembered. My tires kept slipping in dry patches. But I didn't stop. I kept my eyes forward and didn't look in the mirrors. It took 2 hours to get to the highway. I drove all the way back to Flagstaff without stopping once. I didn't even eat. I tried reporting what I saw. A ranger I talked to at a station near Chinley said they sometimes got complaints about squatters or mentally ill folks living out in the brush. They didn't do much. Told me to call the county sheriff if I was really worried. I didn't call again. I didn't go back. I still don't believe in skinwalkers. Not the way the old legends describe them. I don't think a man can turn into a coyote or steal your voice. But I think some people choose to leave humanity behind. I think something can break in a person, out in the empty parts of the world where no one's watching, where there's no help, no rules, and no consequences. And I think once they break, they don't come back. I still wake up sometimes to that sound, the soft clicking, like teeth tapping together in the dark. But I live in a crowded apartment building now. People on all sides, lights everywhere. I haven't been back to the desert since. I never will. I had planned the trip for months, though I didn't want to admit it out loud. After a year of working long hours in the city, cramped in an apartment that felt smaller every day, I needed space. Real space. I wanted silence, fresh air, and the chance to just exist without distractions or deadlines. So I packed a few bags, loaded Max, my old Labrador, into the car, and drove 4 hours to a small cabin tucked deep in the woods of the Cascades in Washington state. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was a one-room wooden shack built on stilts, about 50 years old if I guessed right. The wood was weathered and gray, and the roof sagged in the middle, but it had a solid stone chimney and a rusty metal stove inside. I'd booked it through a local rental service, a family-owned operation that still ran by phone calls and handwritten ledgers. The owner, a quiet man named Tom, warned me the area was isolated and the nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away. That was exactly what I wanted. I arrived in the late afternoon on a cloudy October day, the kind where the sun feels weak and hides behind thick clouds that press down on the trees. Max was restless in the car, nose pressed against the window, ears perked up with every sound of birds or distant traffic on the highway behind us. When we reached the cabin, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The forest stretched all around, mostly fir and cedar trees with bright orange and red maple leaves scattered here and there. The air smelled damp and earthy. I parked on a small dirt clearing, unloaded my gear, and unlocked the cabin door. The air inside was cold and smelled faintly of old wood and moss. I threw a few logs into the stove, struck a match, and watched the flames crawl over dry kindling until they caught. Max settled down by the fire, a soft grunt of contentment escaping his throat. I opened the window a crack to let fresh air in, but kept it mostly shut because the cold was already creeping in. The night came fast in the mountains. I prepared a simple dinner, canned beans and some bread, and ate quietly, my mind already easing away from city noise and the constant buzz of my phone. I had left the charger and the laptop behind. No distractions, just me, Max, and the woods. I spent the evening sitting by the fire, reading a battered paperback about wilderness survival that I had picked up at a thrift store months ago. Max lay close, alert but calm. Every now and then, a soft thump or rustle would come from outside. Falling branches, the wind shifting the leaves. I told myself it was nothing. The forest had sounds. That's all. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It rattled the loose shutters on the cabin windows and caused the chimney to creak. Max suddenly stood up, ears twitching, nose pointed toward the door. I called his name softly, but he didn't sit back down. Instead, he moved to the doorway, the hairs on his back rising slightly. That was the first time I felt genuinely uneasy. I stepped outside with a flashlight, scanning the dark trees. The beam cut through the blackness but found nothing more than swaying branches and thick underbrush. The sky was cloudy, hiding stars, and the only sounds were the wind and Max's low growl. Back inside, I locked the door and drew the curtains tighter. I checked the windows one by one. They were old but sturdy, the kind that made a soft creak if you pushed too hard. I didn't hear or see anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake a tight feeling in my chest. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. Being alone in the dark forest was not the same as being in a city apartment with locked doors and security alarms. This was raw and real. The isolation hit differently. I settled back by the stove, and Max lay down next to me again. His body heat was comforting. I finally started to drift off when a sudden thump at the back of the cabin made me jump. The sound was sharp and close, like something heavy hitting the wood siding. Max snapped awake, ears up, growling louder. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed the flashlight and moved cautiously toward the back door, which was wooden and old but had a decent lock. Outside, the beam flicked over nothing at first, just the dense trees and the dark forest floor. But then, about 10 feet away, I saw a broken branch, freshly snapped, lying on the ground. Something had definitely passed through there. I called Max quietly, trying to steady my breathing. The dog looked to me, eyes wide, tail low but still wagging slowly. I didn't want to imagine some stranger sneaking around this deep in the woods, but the evidence was there. Someone or something had been close. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, Max alert by my side. I listened hard, hearing every snap, every whisper of wind. Nothing else came. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, I was exhausted. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, searching for signs. I found faint footprints in the wet soil near the back, too large and heavy to be animal tracks. They led away into the trees and disappeared. I didn't call the police. There was no proof anyone had malicious intent, and the closest station was over an hour away. Besides, I was alone in the middle of nowhere, miles from help, and the only person I could rely on was Max. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a hunter or someone else who didn't know the cabin was rented. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me, settling deeper into my bones as the day went on. Over the next 2 days, I kept a strict routine. I didn't stray far from the cabin, kept all doors locked, and always carried a flashlight and a small hunting knife I'd brought along just in case. Max never left my side, alert and protective. Each night, the sounds outside grew bolder. Scratches on the siding, footsteps circling the cabin, rustling in the underbrush. I didn't sleep well. My mind jumped at every noise. The forest, once peaceful, had turned hostile. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in cold pinks and grays, I decided to check the nearby trail Tom had mentioned when I booked the cabin. It was a narrow dirt path running down a hill, ending near a river. I thought maybe if I understood the area better, the anxiety would lessen. I packed some water, a flashlight, and clipped Max's leash on. The trail was steep and slippery from recent rain. The trees leaned in, closing the path with thick branches and leaves. After 20 minutes, I heard a crunch behind me. I stopped and turned. Nothing. Max tensed beside me. Suddenly, from the bushes came a figure. A man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. I froze. He didn't say anything or move quickly, just stared at me. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. The man's face was shadowed, unreadable. Max growled low. The man took a step back and disappeared into the woods. I didn't follow. Instead, I hurried back to the cabin, heart pounding. That night was the worst. The noises outside were louder, more aggressive. I heard someone trying to force the back door. Max barked ferociously. I grabbed the knife, staying close to the stove, the only source of light and warmth. Hours passed. Finally, silence. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the door frame, marks from heavy tools or claws. The lock was damaged but still holding. I knew then I wasn't just alone in the woods. Someone had targeted me. I called Tom on my cell, though reception was weak. He told me he'd send someone to check the cabin and asked if I wanted to come home early. I said yes. That afternoon, a rugged local ranger arrived in a truck. He checked the damage and said he'd patrol the area more often and talk to local hunters. I packed up quickly. Max was eager to leave. As I drove away, the forest seemed to swallow the cabin behind me. Back in the city, the silence of my apartment felt safe again. The trip had been everything I wanted and more. Space, nature, peace, but also a reminder that isolation cuts both ways. It can free you, but also make you vulnerable. Max and I still talk about the trip in our quiet way. He's calmer now, but every time I pack a bag, he looks at me like he remembers those dark nights when we weren't alone in the woods. It was the autumn of 1998 when I found myself driving up the winding roads of northern Vermont. I was 27, worn out from the noise and stress of city life in Boston. The idea of spending a week alone in the woods, in a small cabin far from any sign of civilization, felt like a necessary escape. I had no phone, no laptop, just some books, food, and my old camera. The cabin was an old rental owned by a family friend, tucked away on a ridge surrounded by dense pine forest. It wasn't fancy, just a small, weathered wooden cabin with a stone fireplace, a simple bed, and a tiny kitchen with a propane stove. The drive up was long and slow. The road was mostly gravel, riddled with potholes and fallen leaves, twisting through the thick woods. I passed no other cars, no houses, no signs of life except the occasional bird or squirrel. The air smelled sharp and fresh, the coolness of early fall wrapping around me as the sun slipped behind the hills. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No wind, no rustling branches, just a deep, almost heavy silence. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for my car. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped inside. The place smelled of old wood and a faint trace of mildew. The windows were dusty, letting in dim, fading light. I dropped my bags on the floor and set about lighting a fire in the hearth. The dry logs crackled and sparked, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The whole room felt cozy and quiet. For a moment, the cabin seemed like the perfect refuge. That night, I slept deeply, wrapped in thick blankets as the fire died down. Outside, the forest was dark and silent, but inside, I felt safe. The next day, I planned to explore the woods, take photographs, maybe hike to the nearby lake. I had packed a small map and a compass, knowing I shouldn't stray too far without proper navigation. The first few days passed uneventfully. I woke early, ate simple meals, and spent hours wandering through the forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches heavy with needles and the occasional red leaf. The ground was soft with moss and fallen pine cones. Sometimes, I spotted deer tracks or heard the distant call of a hawk. I kept to the marked trails, careful not to lose my way. The solitude was peaceful, almost meditative. But on the fourth day, something changed. It started with small things, shifts in the atmosphere I couldn't explain. I was taking photos near a small clearing when I noticed footprints in the mud. They were large and deep, the shape of boots, but not mine. The trail led away from the clearing into thicker forest. I thought maybe someone else had been here recently, perhaps another hiker or a hunter. I didn't feel scared, just cautious. I followed the trail back toward the cabin, keeping my eyes alert. When I arrived, the door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it that morning. My heart beat faster. I pushed the door closed and double-checked the locks. Nothing seemed missing, but the feeling of being watched crept over me. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. I kept the fire burning longer, staring into the flames. Every sound from outside made me tense. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I tried to tell myself it was just the forest being alive. But in the early hours, when the fire had died and darkness was absolute, I heard something else. A soft, deliberate crunching sound on the gravel path outside. I froze, listening hard. It came closer, slow and steady, then stopped right at the edge of the porch. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the old hunting rifle I'd found in the cabin's corner. It was heavy and unfamiliar in my hands. I kept very still, waiting. After what felt like forever, the sound retreated slowly, footsteps fading into the night. I didn't dare step outside. The next day, I didn't go far. I stayed near the cabin, scanning the woods constantly. I found more signs someone had been there. Fresh cigarette butts near the back shed, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey in the bushes. Someone was nearby, watching. I thought about leaving, but the nearest road was miles away. My car was parked down a steep, muddy hill, and the trail was overgrown and slick with rain from the night before. I was alone, miles from help, with an unknown person lurking somewhere in the forest. The following night was worse. Around midnight, I heard voices, low, muffled talking carried on the wind. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was rough and impatient. The voices circled the cabin, stopping at times, then moving on. I stayed inside, door locked, rifle by my side. I peeked through the window blinds and caught glimpses of shadows moving between the trees. There was no way they hadn't seen the cabin. Whoever they were, they knew I was there. Sleep became impossible. I lay on the bed listening to every sound, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. On the fifth day, I found fresh tire tracks in the dirt road leading up to the cabin. Someone had driven close, maybe just beyond sight. I realized they might have been watching me for days, waiting for a moment when I was vulnerable. That afternoon, I decided to prepare for the worst. I gathered all the food I had, some water, and packed my backpack with the essentials. I planned to leave at first light before anyone else showed up. The night passed with strange noises, footsteps circling the cabin, faint tapping on the walls, a soft knock on the door. I didn't respond, didn't move. At one point, I thought I saw a figure outside the window, standing still and watching me. Morning came slowly. I waited until the sun was just starting to break through the trees, turning the forest gold and red. I opened the door quietly, rifle in hand, and stepped outside. The air was cold and crisp. I moved quickly to my car, heart in my throat, eyes scanning the woods. No one was in sight. The tire tracks showed a path I could follow. I jumped in, started the engine, and backed down the hill carefully. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It looked peaceful in the morning light, just an old building nestled among the trees. But I knew it wasn't. Something had been out there with me, watching, waiting. Back on the main road, the noise of civilization returned. Cars passed, people moved about their daily lives, and the uneasy silence of the woods was gone. I never went back to that cabin. I never wanted to be alone in the forest again. Not in that way. The experience stayed with me for years. How something so quiet and still could feel so dangerous. How close I'd been to a real threat without even knowing who or what it was. The cabin on Black Pine Ridge was just a place, but it showed me how quickly peace can turn to fear, and how important it is to trust your instincts. Sometimes, the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but the unknown people hiding just beyond the trees, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to rent a small cabin in the dense forests of northern Vermont. I was 27 at the time, burnt out from the constant buzz of city life in Boston. My job was demanding, and I craved silence, the kind that comes only when surrounded by miles of trees and a sky so clear you could see the Milky Way with the naked eye. The cabin itself was tucked away in a forgotten patch of forest near a place called Greenwood Hollow, a tiny, almost invisible dot on the map. The owner, an older man named Frank, had assured me over the phone that the place was perfect for someone needing a break. No internet, no cell service, just the woods and the little creek running nearby. The drive up was long, about 3 hours through winding country roads lined by sugar maples, their leaves already turning fiery shades of orange and red. I remember the feeling well, that mix of excitement and relief as the cityscape melted behind me and the endless green canopy took over. The air grew cooler and smelled like damp earth and pine needles crushed underfoot. I arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The cabin sat beside a narrow dirt path, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to block out everything but the fading light. It was small but sturdy, weathered wood, a stone chimney, and a little porch with a swing. Inside, the place was rustic but cozy. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a worn-out couch, a simple dining table, and 2 bedrooms. The windows were thick and old, and though they rattled slightly in the evening breeze, I liked that it felt authentic. After unpacking, I gathered some firewood from a pile stacked near the back door and started a fire in the stove. The warmth spread quickly through the room, casting flickering shadows that danced on the wooden walls. I pulled out a book and sank into the couch, enjoying the quiet, crackling sounds. That first night was uneventful. The forest around the cabin was alive with the rustling of small animals and the distant calls of owls. I slept soundly, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, feeling more at peace than I had in months. The next morning, I woke to a thick fog blanketing the forest. I brewed coffee on the stove and stepped out onto the porch, the damp air clinging to my skin. The mist made everything seem muted, the trees' ghostly shapes fading into the gray. I decided to explore a bit. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods, following the creek upstream. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones, and I walked beside it for nearly an hour, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot the only sound. I felt a strange kind of calm here, almost as if time had slowed down. As afternoon approached, the sun finally broke through the fog, casting golden beams that lit up the forest floor in patches. I made my way back to the cabin, feeling refreshed but also strangely aware of how isolated I was. There were no neighbors in sight, no cars, no signs of other people. That night, After another fire and a simple dinner of canned stew, I sat by the window watching the dark woods. The wind picked up, and the trees swayed, their branches scratching softly against the cabin's siding. I tried to shake off a feeling of unease that had begun to creep in. It was probably just the solitude, I told myself. Around midnight, I woke to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was more deliberate, something dragging across the forest floor. I sat up, straining to listen. The noise stopped, then started again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and carefully opened the door. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the trees. The creek's murmur was steady, but there was a faint rustling sound from the underbrush. My heart hammered as I scanned the shadows. I saw nothing at first, just the shifting shapes of pine trunks. Then movement caught my eye, a figure stepping lightly between the trees. It was a man, thin and wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap, but his face was obscured by shadows. I froze, unsure if I should call out or run inside. The man didn't seem to notice me. He moved slowly, almost cautiously, like he was searching for something. I shut the door quietly and locked it, retreating to the corner of the room near the window. The man stayed at the edge of the clearing for several minutes, then turned and disappeared back into the woods. Sleep was impossible after that. I kept imagining what he might have been doing there. Was he lost, hunting, or something else? I had no cell service to call for help or even to check if anyone else was around. The next day, I found footprints outside, pressed into the damp soil, rough boots, fresh. They circled the cabin but never came closer than 10 feet from the porch. I spent the morning clearing brush near the cabin to improve visibility and tried to stay alert. Still, no one else came by. The forest seemed to close in tighter as the day passed. By evening, the sky had darkened prematurely under heavy clouds. I doubled the woodpile and battened down the windows, my senses heightened. That night was the worst. The man returned, I was sure of it. I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and careful, as if he was waiting for me to show some sign. The floorboards creaked outside, just beyond the porch. The scratching noises resumed, louder this time, like claws scraping on wood. I kept the lights off, huddled by the stove, heart pounding so loud it echoed in my ears. The man was silent but relentless in his presence. Hours felt like days. Around dawn, the noises stopped. I dared to look outside and saw no one, but the unease stayed with me. By the third day, I was exhausted, barely eating, just watching for movement. I decided to pack up early. As I gathered my things, I spotted a makeshift campfire site a few hundred feet into the woods, one I hadn't noticed before. Blackened stones, a few scattered cans, and a torn piece of cloth. The realization hit me like a punch. Someone had been living near the cabin, maybe watching me for days. I took a deep breath and walked briskly back to the car, loaded with all my belongings. I kept glancing behind me, convinced the man could appear at any moment. The drive back was tense. Every shadow seemed like a figure watching me from the trees. The roads felt narrower, and the silence in the car was deafening. When I finally reached the highway and saw signs of civilization, other cars, gas stations, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me cry. Later, I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office. They told me people sometimes camp illegally or hide out in the woods. A search was organized, but they found no trace of the man or any camps near the cabin. The owner said he never had issues before, but after I left, he removed the listing from rental sites. Years later, I still think about that trip, how the quiet forest can feel alive in the wrong way. It taught me that nature's beauty can mask the raw unpredictability of people. And sometimes, the real danger isn't in monsters or legends, but in the shadows where others hide, watching, waiting.